Midnight hit, and something that was supposed to be routine instantly turned into chaos. Not hype chaos, not influencer noise, real systems on fire chaos. Millions of people were already logged in, fingers hovering, refreshing screens, waiting for a single page to load. This wasn't a sneaker drop. This wasn't a Jordan retro. This wasn't even supposed to be a moment. It was just a simple merchandise release tied to one player. And yet, within seconds, Nike, a company built to handle global-scale demand, started falling apart in real time. Error messages flooded screens, checkouts froze, apps crashed completely, pages refused to load no matter how many times users refreshed. This was infrastructure designed to survive Supreme drops, Travis Scott chaos, World Cup traffic, and Black Friday surges. And it didn't just struggle, it collapsed. Entire regions went dark, customer support lines lit up, internal alerts exploded, engineers scrambled, and all of it traced back to one item going live at midnight, a $40 logo t-shirt connected to Caitlin Clark. That's the part nobody expected, not the fans, and definitely not Nike. This wasn't supposed to test the limits of a billion-dollar tech stack. It wasn't meant to expose blind spots inside one of the most sophisticated retail machines on the planet. But within the first minute, traffic spiked to levels Nike executives later admitted they had never modeled for a women's basketball product. Not for a shoe, not for a full collection, for a single shirt. And once the system started buckling, there was no slowing it down. What makes this moment different isn't just the speed or the volume, it's the realization that followed. Somewhere between the servers crashing and the apps going offline, it became painfully clear that this wasn't a freak spike or a lucky surge. This was demand that had been underestimated from the start. Demand that had been quietly building for months while the company moved cautiously, assuming it had time. Midnight didn't create the chaos. Midnight just revealed it. Because once you strip away the headlines and the viral clips, this launch exposed something far bigger than a merch drop gone wrong. It exposed how deeply women's basketball had been misread at the corporate level, how expectations were set low not because the audience wasn't there, but because belief never fully caught up to reality. And when that belief finally collided with actual demand, the result wasn't a sold-out page, it was a system failure heard around the world. And that's why this story doesn't start with a t-shirt. It starts with a miscalculation, one that turned a quiet midnight launch into the most revealing moment Nike never planned for, and a warning sign the entire sports industry couldn't ignore. When Nike officially signed Caitlin Clark in April 2024, the announcement landed exactly the way Nike wanted. Clean headlines, polished visuals, the sense that one of the most powerful brands in sports had locked in the future of women's basketball. At the time, it felt inevitable that merch would follow quickly. That's how Nike works. They're famous for speed. Signature shoes in months, apparel lines spun up seemingly overnight. Momentum is usually something they manufacture, not wait on. And yet, after the signing, nothing happened. Weeks passed, then months. Fans kept asking the same question in comment sections, forums, and social feeds. Where's the merch? Where's the logo? Where's literally anything with her name on it? Clark's profile was exploding on the court, her highlights were everywhere, and her cultural footprint was growing by the week. But Nike's shelves stayed empty. No tees, no hoodies, no quick capsule drop to test demand, just silence. For a brand built on striking while the iron is hot, that silence felt off. By the 6-month mark, the confusion turned into speculation, not the wild kind, but the practical kind. People started wondering if Nike was moving slowly on purpose. Some thought the company was being careful. Others assumed they were waiting for the perfect moment. But as the months stacked up, 9, 12, 15, the narrative shifted. This no longer looked strategic. It started to look like hesitation, especially when you consider that Nike has launched entirely new shoe silhouettes faster than it took them to release a basic logo shirt. By the time a year had passed, the question stopped being polite. Fans weren't just asking where the merchandise was, they were asking why Nike didn't seem to grasp what they were sitting on. Clark wasn't a niche rookie anymore. She was one of the most talked about athletes in the sport, period. And yet the company that prides itself on cultural timing appeared disconnected from the moment unfolding right in front of them. The longer the delay went on, the louder the red flags became. 18 months after the signing, when Nike finally moved, it almost felt like they were trying to quietly catch up rather than lead. A simple logo, a late-night drop, no massive buildup, no aggressive marketing rollout. The kind of release you'd expect for a low-risk test, not for an athlete already commanding national attention. And that's the detail that matters, because the silence wasn't just about product delays, it was about expectation. Nike's pace suggested they didn't believe demand would explode. They believed it would arrive slowly, predictably, under control. That belief is what made everything that followed so shocking. Because the moment Nike finally broke that silence, it became obvious the demand hadn't been waiting patiently. It had been stacking, compressing, building pressure the entire time. And the longer Nike waited to acknowledge it, the bigger the release was going to be. What looked like a cautious rollout was actually the calm before something much louder and much more revealing than anyone inside the building was prepared for. When Nike put its name next to Caitlin Clark in April 2024, the assumption was simple: merchandise would follow fast. That's the Nike playbook. Sign the athlete, strike while attention is peaking, and turn momentum into product before the moment cools. But after the announcement buzz faded, something strange happened. Nothing dropped. No teaser, no limited run, not even a basic name tee. Just a long, uncomfortable quiet. At first, fans brushed it off. Big brands move slow sometimes, right? Maybe Nike was planning something huge. Maybe they were waiting for the perfect design or the perfect timing. But as weeks turned into months, that patience started to wear thin. Clark's visibility was exploding in real time. Her games were pulling historic numbers. Her name was everywhere. Meanwhile, the company built on urgency and cultural instinct was standing still. For a brand that can push a signature shoe from concept to shelf in under a year, the silence felt increasingly hard to explain. By the 6th month mark, the questions got louder. Comment sections filled up with the same frustration. How does Nike not have anything ready? By month 9, the tone shifted from confusion to concern. Fans weren't just asking where the merch was, they were asking whether Nike truly understood who they had signed. Because this didn't feel like patience anymore. It felt like hesitation. Almost as if the company was treating Clark like a long-term experiment instead of a present-day force. The deeper problem was perception. Nike's inaction sent a message, whether intentional or not. It suggested that demand was uncertain, that women's basketball merch needed extra caution, that this moment could wait, and that assumption stood in stark contrast to what was happening outside Nike's walls, where interest wasn't slowing, it was compounding. Every week without a drop wasn't cooling demand, it was storing it. By the time a full year passed with nothing on shelves, the silence itself became the story. Fans started saying something didn't add up. Analysts quietly wondered why a company famous for shaping culture looked like it was reacting to it instead. And when 18 months finally came and Nike prepared to release its first piece of Clark merchandise, the decision revealed everything. A single logo tee, late night, minimal buildup, a release strategy that screamed low-risk test, not cultural event. That gap between reality and expectation is where the red flags were hiding. Nike didn't move like a brand sitting on a phenomenon. They moved like a brand unsure how big the phenomenon really was. And that misread didn't just delay a product, it quietly set the stage for one of the most dramatic wake-up calls the company had ever experienced. Because all that demand Nike thought would arrive slowly had actually been piling up the entire time, waiting for the moment the silence finally broke. When Nike finally broke the silence, they did it with confidence. Quiet confidence. Internal confidence. According to reports, the company believed it had done its homework this time. The product was simple, the pricing was accessible, and the inventory numbers were supposed to eliminate any chance of embarrassment. 2 million units were prepared for launch. For context, that's more than what's often allocated for high-profile releases tied to established legends. Inside Nike, this wasn't viewed as cautious, it was framed as aggressive, over-prepared even. The logic made sense on paper. This wasn't a shoe, not yet. It was a t-shirt. No complex sizing curves, no tech specs, no signature performance promises, just a clean logo tied to Caitlin Clark, priced at $40 for adults and slightly less for kids. The kind of product designed to move volume without friction. Nike believed 2 million units would comfortably satisfy early demand, generate buzz, and leave room to scale if needed. They weren't testing scarcity, they were testing sustainability. That assumption is the key. Internally, Nike treated this like a normal ramp-up. The belief was that interest would be strong but manageable, that demand would roll in waves, not all at once, that the audience would behave like a traditional apparel consumer base, spread across regions and time zones. This is how most launches work. This is how Nike has trained itself to think, and historically it's worked. But what Nike failed to account for was how compressed this demand had become. Months of waiting had turned attention into anticipation, anticipation into fixation. Fans weren't discovering the product when it launched. They were waiting for it, tracking it, setting alarms, coordinating across social media. 2 million units sounds massive until everyone shows up at the same moment expecting access. The late-night release only amplified the problem. Midnight drops are designed to build excitement while controlling traffic spikes. Nike assumed demand would disperse naturally over hours. Instead, it synchronized the audience. The simplicity of the product removed hesitation. There was no "should I buy this" moment. It was click or miss, and millions clicked at once. From Nike's perspective, this was the opposite of underproduction. They believed they had gone beyond what was necessary. In reality, they had simply misread the scale. 2 million units weren't excessive, they were insufficient. Not because the product was rare, but because interest had grown far beyond Nike's internal benchmarks for women's basketball merchandise. And that's why this launch wasn't underprepared in the traditional sense. The factories were ready, the inventory existed, the product was clean and accessible. What failed wasn't supply alone, it was expectation. Nike planned for a strong launch. What they got was a convergence event, where demand, timing, and attention collapsed into a single moment their systems and assumptions were never built to handle. The clock hit midnight, and within seconds, it was clear something was wrong. Not high traffic wrong, not refresh and try again wrong. This was full system failure unfolding in real time. Pages stalled before loading, checkouts froze mid-click, users were kicked out of carts they'd already filled, error messages popped up in multiple languages as regions began failing one by one. For a brief moment, it felt like a glitch. Then reality set in. Nike wasn't struggling to keep up, it was collapsing. This wasn't a small site buckling under pressure. This was infrastructure designed to process billions in annual commerce, built to survive World Cup traffic, Black Friday Russians, and the most aggressive sneaker drops on the planet. And yet, less than 60 seconds after the launch went live, those systems started timing out. Traffic surged past modeled limits almost instantly. Internal safeguards triggered, automated protections shut down pathways, and suddenly millions of customers were staring at broken screens, all trying to buy the same t-shirt tied to Caitlin Clark. What happened next surprised even the engineers watching the dashboards. The spike didn't level off, it intensified. 10 million site visits piled in almost immediately, overwhelming regions simultaneously instead of in waves. The Nike app crashed alongside the website, eliminating backup access points. Customer queues failed to stabilize. Every workaround collapsed under the same pressure. This wasn't localized demand. It was global, synchronized, and relentless. As North America went down, Europe was already lining up. When their release window opened hours later, the same thing happened again. Servers flared, error rates spiked, and checkout failures spread across the continent. Asia followed shortly after, with systems crashing under the same strain.
This wasn't a one-off technical hiccup. It was a pattern repeating itself across time zones, exposing just how far demand had exceeded Nike's internal forecasts. Before systems fully failed, the numbers that did get through told a terrifying story. Hundreds of thousands of successful orders processed in under an hour, tens of millions in revenue secured before the infrastructure shut itself down to prevent deeper damage. And that's the part that reframed everything. This wasn't chaos without conversion. This was chaos paired with massive volume, suggesting that if the systems had held, the scale would have been historic. Inside Nike, this wasn't treated like a bad launch. It was treated like a fire alarm. Emergency alerts went out. Engineers were pulled in immediately. Teams that weren't scheduled until morning were suddenly logging on in the middle of the night because the realization hit fast and hard. This wasn't a traffic spike that could be smoothed out. This was demand behaving in a way Nike had never seen for a women's basketball product. 60 seconds was all it took to expose the gap between what Nike planned for and what actually existed. In 1 minute, the illusion of controlled growth shattered. The numbers coming in didn't just suggest success, they suggested a ceiling that had been set far too low. And while fans were still stuck refreshing broken pages, a second economy was already spinning up in the background, ready to exploit the imbalance Nike had just accidentally revealed. While regular fans were still staring at frozen checkout screens, a completely different battle was already being fought behind the scenes. The moment Nike's systems began failing, the secondary market smelled blood. Professional resellers, armed with bots, scripts, and years of experience exploiting chaos, moved faster than any human could. Where fans clicked refresh, resellers bypassed queues. Where apps crashed, automated checkouts slipped through, and within minutes, large blocks of the Caitlin Clark logo shirts were already gone from circulation.
The resale listings appeared almost instantly, as if they'd been waiting for the launch to break. Prices jumped before most people even realized the shirt had sold out. $200, $300, $400. Some listings climbed even higher as scarcity became undeniable. Platforms that typically thrive on sneaker hype suddenly found themselves dominated by a single item, a WNBA player's logo tee outperforming Supreme drops, limited Jordans, and celebrity collaborations in sheer trading volume. What made this moment surreal was the speed. Usually, resale markets take days to establish pricing. Here, value is set in real time. The chaos on Nike's site created an artificial scarcity window that resellers exploited perfectly. Regular buyers never stood a chance. By the time many fans realized the site wasn't coming back up, the secondary market had already decided what the product was worth. Data from resale platforms revealed something even more shocking. The Clark logo shirt wasn't just selling well, it was trading at a pace rarely seen for any apparel item, not just women's basketball merchandise, any Nike product. The volume of transactions in the first 24 hours eclipsed launches tied to global superstars. That's when the narrative officially flipped. This wasn't unexpected interest, this was demand being monetized by anyone except the company that created the product. Stories started circulating about individual resellers clearing tens of thousands of dollars in a single night. While fans were locked out, bots were checking out hundreds of units. The imbalance became impossible to ignore. For every authentic shirt successfully sold at retail, several more were already changing hands for profit. And Nike could see all of it happening in real time, every inflated listing serving as proof of how badly demand had been misjudged. The most ironic part was what the resale market confirmed. Nike didn't underproduce because they feared lack of interest. They underproduced because they failed to imagine concentration. The audience didn't spread out over days, it showed up all at once. The secondary market simply absorbed the overflow and set prices that reflected what Nike hadn't dared to assume in the first place. By the end of the first day, the damage was done, not to the brand's image, but to its assumptions. A single t-shirt had become one of the most actively traded items in the entire resale ecosystem.
And while Nike scrambled to stabilize its systems, the message was already clear. Whatever Nike thought Caitlin Clark merchandise was worth, the market had just proven it was wrong, loudly, instantly, and for everyone to see. By the time most of the world was asleep, the tone inside Nike had completely changed. This was no longer a "we'll fix it in the morning" situation. According to reports, internal escalation protocols kicked in before the hour was over. Phones started ringing in the middle of the night. Senior managers were looped in. Engineers who weren't even on rotation were pulled out of bed. Somewhere around 3 a.m., this stopped being an IT issue and became an executive-level crisis for Nike. Emergency calls replaced dashboards. What executives were being shown wasn't just system failures, it was demand curves that made no sense by Nike's historical standards. Numbers climbing too fast, orders processing at a pace that suggested the crash wasn't preventing interest, only bottlenecking it. The realization hit hard. The company hadn't just underestimated demand, it had misunderstood it entirely. This wasn't a strong launch derailed by traffic. This was a cultural moment trying to force its way through infrastructure that hadn't been built for it. That's when containment turned into reaction. Factories in Southeast Asia were flagged immediately. Production partners in Indonesia and Vietnam were contacted overnight. Overtime shifts were discussed before sunrise. Shipping partners were alerted that priority capacity might be needed on short notice. According to industry chatter, Nike began mapping out an emergency expansion plan within hours, not days. The assumption that 2 million units would last weeks was already dead. The new question was how fast millions more could physically be made. Inside those early morning meetings, the mood reportedly shifted from frustration to alarm. Every resale listing climbing higher was being interpreted as lost revenue and lost control. The secondary market wasn't just profiting, it was validating a level of consumer demand Nike hadn't dared to price for. Executives weren't just staring at broken systems anymore, they were staring at proof that their internal expectations for women's basketball merchandise were wildly outdated. By sunrise, decisions had already been made. Additional units would be ordered immediately. Logistics costs would be absorbed, no matter how expensive. Distribution priorities would be reshuffled. Entire shipping runs would be dedicated to a product that days earlier was treated like a cautious test. What usually took months of forecasting and approvals was compressed into a single night of urgent calls and rapid sign-offs.
And that's the real meaning of the 3 a.m. wake-up call. It wasn't about servers crashing or apps failing. It was about a belief system collapsing. Nike didn't wake up because technology broke. They woke up because the market spoke louder than their models, louder than their forecasts, louder than decades of assumptions about how women's basketball products were supposed to perform. By the time the sun came up, the company knew one thing for certain. This launch hadn't just exceeded expectations, it had rewritten them, and there was no going back to sleep on it. The moment Wall Street opened its eyes, the narrative shifted again. This was no longer a viral story living online or a back-end crisis being solved internally. This had crossed into financial territory. In pre-market trading, Nike stock moved sharply upward, and analysts didn't hesitate to connect the dots. A single merchandise launch, one t-shirt tied to Caitlin Clark, had done something almost unthinkable. It materially moved a company valued at roughly $150 billion. That's what stopped people in their tracks. Big companies don't swing on one product, not like this. Nike sells everything from performance gear to global lifestyle apparel. Its revenue streams are diversified across continents. And yet, analysts were openly upgrading ratings and revising outlooks based on what they were calling a demand signal event. In simple terms, chaos was being interpreted as opportunity. Investors didn't see a failed rollout, they saw proof of untapped upside. The logic was brutally clear. If a basic logo t-shirt could generate this level of traffic, conversion, and cultural attention despite system failures, then the ceiling for a full product ecosystem was far higher than anyone had priced in. This wasn't about the revenue from shirts already sold. It was about what the launch revealed. Analysts weren't reacting to what Nike earned. They were reacting to what Nike could earn if it actually planned for this level of interest going forward. That's why the stock movement mattered so much. Markets don't care about vibes, they care about forward-looking demand. And this event forced investors to recalibrate how valuable women's basketball could be as a commercial category. Not someday, not eventually, now. When financial models started factoring in expanded merchandise lines, global rollout efficiency, and long-term brand lift tied to Clark, the impact suddenly justified itself. Inside Nike, that reaction carried weight. Stock movement is a language executives understand instantly. It validated the overnight decisions, the emergency production runs, the logistical chaos. More importantly, it signaled that this wasn't just a win, it was a course correction moment, something the company could not afford to downplay or miss again. When people say a t-shirt moved a $150 billion company, they're not being dramatic. They're describing a rare moment when demand shattered expectations so completely that it forced both the market and the brand to see an entire category differently. One athlete, one logo, one product, and suddenly the valuation conversation around women's basketball wasn't theoretical anymore. It was priced in. What happened next is where the story stopped being about sports altogether. Once the launch chaos spilled into the public eye, the shirt stopped functioning as merchandise and started operating as a signal. Owning it wasn't just about supporting a player. It became proof that you were early, connected, and part of something unfolding in real time. Within hours, the Caitlin Clark logo tee was no longer just a Nike product. It was a cultural shortcut. Social media poured gasoline on it. Videos of people refreshing broken pages exploded across TikTok and Instagram. Clips of fans reacting, some celebrating, some frustrated, some openly emotional, racked up millions of views. One short video of a fan missing out reportedly outperformed most professional sports highlights that week. The narrative flipped from "Why won't Nike load?" to "How big is this moment really?" Once that question entered the conversation, the shirt became bigger than the transaction itself. Celebrities leaned in almost immediately, not quietly, not subtly. High-profile athletes, musicians, and public figures appeared wearing the logo in public and online, and every sighting sent search traffic spiking again. Whether organic or amplified, it didn't matter. The effect was the same. The audience multiplied. Fashion outlets that normally ignore performance apparel began covering the shirt as a trend piece. Suddenly, a basketball logo tee was sitting in the same conversations as designer drops and streetwear exclusives. What made it even more surreal was how fast the symbolism took over. On college campuses, the shirt became currency. People traded for it, borrowed it, showed it off like a badge. In high schools, kids argued over authenticity and resale value like they would with rare sneakers. Underground exchanges popped up where shirts were flipped for electronics, concert tickets, even cars. This wasn't hype manufactured by a limited release strategy. It was status created by demand colliding with scarcity. Internationally, the effect was even louder. In markets where women's basketball had never driven fashion conversations, the Clark logo suddenly meant something. Fans who didn't watch the WNBA knew exactly what the shirt represented. It wasn't about team allegiance, it was about momentum. The idea that women's basketball had crossed into mainstream cultural relevance and done it without asking for permission.
At that point, the product had escaped Nike's control in the best and worst ways. It no longer needed marketing. The culture was doing the work for them. The shirt wasn't being promoted as performance gear or fan merchandise. It was being worn as a statement, a signal that said, "I know what's happening and I was part of it when it broke." That's the moment the rules changed. Because once a sports product becomes a status symbol, it stops behaving like apparel. It becomes identity. And once that happened, there was no version of this story where Caitlin Clark's merch could ever go back to being just another launch. What this moment ultimately exposed was never about one player outperforming expectations. It was about an entire sport being underestimated at the structural level for years. The numbers forced a conversation that executives, brands, and broadcasters had quietly avoided. Women's basketball wasn't lacking demand, it was lacking belief. The infrastructure wasn't built because nobody thought it needed to be, and when real demand finally showed up, it didn't politely fit inside those outdated assumptions, it overwhelmed them. For decades, the prevailing logic around the WNBA was rooted in caution. Smaller production runs, limited merch options, conservative forecasts. The unspoken assumption was that women's basketball could be culturally important, but commercially fragile, that it needed to be handled carefully, slowly, incrementally. What the Caitlin Clark launch revealed is how wrong that thinking was. Demand didn't grow gradually. It arrived fully formed, global, and aggressive, ready to spend and ready to show up all at once. The most uncomfortable part for the industry is comparison. Clark's merchandise didn't just outperform expectations for women's sports, it rivaled and in some windows exceeded launches historically reserved for the biggest names in men's basketball. That forces a hard question. If one player's logo can generate that kind of response, what was holding the rest of the ecosystem back? It clearly wasn't the audience. It wasn't interest. It was investment. This moment also exposed how shallow the existing commercial framework really was. The resale chaos, the counterfeit surge, the broken platforms, those aren't signs of hype gone wrong. They're symptoms of infrastructure built too small for the audience it was meant to serve. When women's basketball finally produced a moment that demanded scale, the system around it couldn't support it. That's not a player problem, that's a planning problem. And it reshapes future conversations instantly. Media rights negotiations, sponsorship deals, player endorsements. Those numbers are no longer hypothetical, they're evidence. When executives sit down to negotiate the next broadcast package or sponsor commitment, this launch becomes a reference point, proof that women's basketball isn't a charity play or a long-term gamble. It's an undervalued asset that finally showed its real ceiling. What makes this bigger than Caitlin Clark herself is what it unlocks for everyone else. When future stars step into negotiations, these results sit in the background. When brands consider whether to fully back women's basketball or play it safe again, this moment hangs over the room. The argument that the market isn't ready doesn't survive a launch that crashes global systems. In the end, this wasn't a breakthrough because it surprised fans. Fans already knew the interest was there. It was a breakthrough because it cornered decision-makers with undeniable proof. The launch didn't just expose demand, it exposed how long that demand had been ignored and how expensive that ignorance turned out to be. When all the noise settles, that's the part that lingers. Not the crashes, not the resale numbers, not even the viral moments. The assumption that finally collapsed was far more fundamental than any failed rollout. For years, the quiet belief inside boardrooms was that women's basketball had limits. Limits on audience size, limits on spending power, limits on cultural reach. Those limits shaped every decision: how much to produce, how fast to move, how seriously to invest. And one t-shirt exposed how artificial those limits really were. What Caitlin Clark didn't do was magically create demand overnight. She revealed it. The audience was already there, waiting through months of silence, ready the moment the door opened. The collapse happened not because the product was too popular, but because expectations had been set too low. When reality finally arrived, it didn't match the models, the forecasts, or the old narratives, and the system buckled under the weight of that disconnect.
This is why the moment matters beyond one athlete and one brand. It permanently shifts how women's basketball can be talked about in business conversations. Not as potential, not as growing, not as something that might pay off later, but as a commercial force that demands serious infrastructure, serious investment, and serious belief from the start. The numbers don't need interpretation anymore. They speak for themselves. And yes, timing played a role, media coverage played a role, visibility played a role. That's true, but timing doesn't crash global systems by itself. Visibility doesn't create $500 million demand in a vacuum. Those things only amplify what already exists. This launch proved the ceiling wasn't reached, it was misread entirely. What happens next is where the real change begins. Brands will move differently, deals will be structured differently, media rights will be negotiated differently. Players coming up behind Clark will walk into rooms with leverage no one had before. Every conversation about women's basketball's value now has a data point that can't be ignored. The Caitlin Clark logo didn't just break a website, it broke a mindset. It broke the assumption that women's basketball needed to be treated carefully instead of confidently. And once that assumption collapsed, there was no way to rebuild it, because now everyone has seen what happens when belief finally catches up to reality, and there's no putting that back in the box.